Thank you all so much for coming this afternoon to our presentation. My name is Danielle Knapp. I'm the McCosh Associate Curator here at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. On behalf of our director, Jill Hartz, who's traveling in Mexico right now, so unfortunately couldn't be here for this event with us and the rest of the staff, we are so excited about this program today. This book, Morris Graves Selected Letters, co-edited by Lawrence Fong and Vicki Halper, is really an amazing publication, and so we're so happy you're all joining us to celebrate it. I'd like to extend a special welcome to Robert Yarber and Desiree Yarber from the Morris Graves Foundation. Most of you, I think, were probably in attendance at the wonderful talk Robert just gave at the library earlier this afternoon. We're so glad that you both could be here this weekend to celebrate with these events with us. We are pleased to have worked in partnership with the Knight Library's Special Collections and University Archives with James Fox and all of his colleagues to put together the programming this weekend in celebration also of the Morris Graves Papers, a collection of not just correspondence, but exhibition materials, drawings, sketchbooks, personal and professional papers by Morris Graves that are now available to researchers at the library. As we mentioned earlier, if you were at that talk, there's a special exhibition called Art in Nature, an exhibit of the life of Morris Graves that's on view at the Knight Library only until 4:30 today. So if you haven't had a chance to see it before today's talk, please come back in May when it will be on view again for most of the month. Welcome to Dick Easley and H.P. Lynn from the White Lotus Gallery, who currently have a special exhibition of Morris Graves' works, paintings and drawings spanning 1931 to 1996. All of the artwork is from the Morris Graves Foundation. Much of it is from early in Morris Graves' career. It's a really beautiful show, so I encourage you to see that downtown if you have a chance in the coming month. We're so grateful to have all of you here with us, and thank you too to the Literary Duck for co-sponsoring today's event. A reception and a book signing will follow the presentation by Larry and Vicki. The JSMA is fortunate to be home to the largest collection of Graves' works on paper, and so we have two special exhibitions on view concurrently now too. One has been up for a couple of months and will remain up until the spring upstairs in the Morris Graves Gallery, a selection of works that are hibernating animals from his time in Ireland. That gallery closes at 5 today, our regular closing time, if you want to see it after these events. In the Gilkey Center, just this past week in this hall, this floor, we've opened a show that's a selection of works from our permanent collection related to the correspondence that's covered in this book. Some of the images or paintings that were featured and were shown in Robert's presentation. That space will be kept open until 5:30 tonight as we have our reception going past our usual closing hours. Although, please don't take any food or drink into that space. Please enjoy them here during the reception and then have a chance to look at the art. And then also, too, if you have some time, we're trying to gather public opinion on our programming, so there's some surveys on the back table next to information about upcoming events, too, that's also available on our website. So we are thrilled to have Lawrence Fong and Vicki Halper here today to share excerpts from Morris Graves' Selected Letters with us. As many in this audience already know, Larry Fong was the curator of American and regional art here at the museum for several years until his recent retirement. He has a master's degree from the University of Arizona, and his professional interests and experiences include modern and contemporary art, curatorial practices, and material culture. Vicki Halper is an independent curator and art historian. She was the associate curator of modern art at the Seattle Art Museum and is a recent James Fenwick Fellow of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. This book that they have recently published represents many years of dedicated work and careful study of the Morris Graves letters, and I'm sure as you'll all agree with me, not only is it an important contribution to the field of scholarship on Morris Graves, but really a fascinating, compelling read in its own right. So we are so pleased that we all get to hear about it from you, and thank you so much. And please join me in welcoming Vicki and Larry.
When the painter Morris Graves died in 2001 at age 91, he left about 80 cartons of personal papers at the lake, his final home in Northern California. Most of the papers were letters to and from the artist. Letters by visual artists are rare, unlike letters by novelists, whose trade is verbal rather than visual. This cache, covering almost 70 years of the artist's life, may be unique. Larry Fong, then curator here at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art, asked me if I would join him in editing the letters for publication. That was 6 years ago. Both of us had personal contacts with Graves. Larry was in charge of a collection of drawings and study materials that the artist had sold to the University of Oregon in the 1960s when he was in dire financial straits over the ever-increasing costs of building the lake. I had befriended Graves and Robert Yarber, his companion and caretaker at the lake, when I was a curator at Seattle Art Museum. I visited them twice when Graves was in his 80s in preparation for an exhibition of Graves' flower paintings at the Seattle Art Museum. Robert and Desiree Yarber of the Morris Graves Foundation donated the letters to the University of Oregon Library, which opened them to the public today. We drew from these letters and from other important sources. For example, many of the letters that Larry will read today are from the archives of the Willard Gallery of New York, which represented Graves from the 1940s to the 1980s. I'll be reading from the letters of Richard Svare that are housed in the University of Washington and elsewhere. After the introduction, Larry and I will focus on three subjects: Graves' internment by the Army for refusing to serve in World War II, his intimate relationship with Richard Svare, and his writings about art. The following reading is from the introduction to Morris Graves' selected letters. Despite his recurring dismay over the demands of letter writing, the painter Morris Graves was a committed, sometimes obsessive correspondent. His need to describe, justify, expound, and verbally delight faltered only in his old age. He wrote multiple drafts of even the simplest letters, not only to correct his poor spelling, but to better mold his thoughts. Given his large script, his letters were often over 10 pages long. Graves regularly added postscripts to amend or emphasize what he had just penned. He saved his drafts, and many correspondents kept his letters. Perhaps family and friends predicted future greatness, as he did himself, or treasured his insightful, heartfelt prose as an additional art form practiced by the artist. In the first letter in this book, written by Graves' father shortly before he committed suicide, the elder Graves remarks on his son's literary skills. This is from a letter from Edwin to Morris Graves, Seattle, 1934. Your description of the canvas you are now working on was much enjoyed by me. My mind leans towards writing, and I think yours does too. I am judging now by your word picture of your latest attempt. To Morris Graves' accomplishment as a painter, architect, interior designer, and landscape designer, we can add his skill as a writer with a similar intensity and often with a similar finesse. Graves was a lifelong aesthete. His interest in objects, architecture, interior design, and painting was evident by his teens. His theatrical persona was likewise clear. Dramatic moods punctuated his life, and examples of despair, anger, and elation are repeatedly recorded in his correspondence. Although his emotions could be operatic, they were not false, which may be why his dearest friends were accommodating and lasting. While some blamed Graves for his grandiosity, particularly as evident in the homes he built and restored, others reveled in the orderly beauty of the spaces he designed and in the delight of his loyal, playful, and heartfelt spirit. A book of letters is not a biography. There is no attempt to describe a complete life. Graves' childhood, before physical separation necessitated letter writing in order to keep in touch with family and friends, is not covered except in later reflections. Old age, when Graves' energy diminished and long-distance telephone service replaced some of the need to write, is less featured than his middle period. During those middle years, travel abroad and a gallery and friends on an opposite coast encouraged or required correspondence. As in an autobiography, the subject decides what to write or omit, what letters to save or burn. Important events, such as the suicide of Morris's father, may scarcely be mentioned. Important correspondence, such as that between Graves and fellow artist Mark Tobey, may have gone up in flames. However, unlike an autobiography, which is the writer's reflection at one point in time, a book of letters reveals the subject's thinking over the years. Letters give primary evidence that particular traits of the mature painter were present or absent in his youth. They tell us if he viewed his art and his needs differently as he aged. In an autobiography, nobody talks back to the author. In this book of letters, others get to speak their minds through their correspondence with the subject or with each other. The subject can't control everything. After the artist, the editors are a second filter. We get to pick and choose among the subject's words. We admire Graves' wit, but think that his complaints about carpenters, for example, occupy too much space in the files. Repetitive philosophizing gets omitted. Given a choice between comprehensiveness and liveliness, we opted for the latter. We also opted for a topical rather than a chronological arrangement of letters, giving a complex life an imposed structure. Discussions about painting were our priority, but only a fraction of Graves' correspondence concerns the making of art. Rather, this is the record of a man who led an aestheticized life, for whom each situation had the potential for grace and beauty or for disastrous disappointment. That he wavered between craving the life of a monk and that of a prince only multiplied his potential for frustration. His friend Jan Thompson said about Graves in a 1983 interview for the Archives of American Art, "Oh, he's very much a mystic, but there's also the other side of the coin. For everything about him, just about the opposite that can be said is true, you know. The way he wants to be Gandhi and live like Gandhi, with just a pair of sandals and nothing. And the other half wants to live like Frederick II. When Graves succeeded with his painting, architecture, or friendships, he created magic. When he failed, there is true despair. While Graves did write about roof repairs and buying a truck, we generally represent him in this volume by highs and lows rather than by the humdrum. Go ahead.
This selection of letters is about his experience with the Army and incarceration, and they're included in the People section under both family and friends. In April 1942, Graves was drafted into the Army against his will. He had not at that time applied for conscientious objector status. After refusing to cooperate, Graves was placed in stockades in Fort Lewis, Washington, Camp Roberts, California, for a total of 11 months. He fled twice, but he was eventually given an honorable discharge in March 1943. In this letter from Morris Graves, he writes to his brother Russell, 1942. I would hold to our ideals, not with a set-jaw stubbornness, but prayerfully feeling my way in relationship to this new world travail. I'm heightened in my awareness to this relationship because I'm now physically confronted by it, as well as abstractly confronted by confused and anguished men, casting out for safety and direction and protection. Men wrapped in fear, and more desperate yet, there are those who, under the disguise of patriotism, are under the sincere belief that they are giving their lives over to one great and honest cause, have submitted to the brutalizing philosophy of the Army and have steeled themselves against and closed out all of the sensitive, humane responses. At the time of this letter, Graves had gone AWOL. Nancy Wilson Ross, a novelist and scholar of Asian religion, was a Washington State native, a graduate of the University of Oregon, and friend of Graves from the 1930s. Marion Willard founded and directed the Willard Gallery in New York from 1936 to 1974. This letter is from Nancy Wilson Ross to Marion Willard, Poulsbo, Washington, 1942. It begins, "Willie, darling, I've wanted to write to you news of Morris, but have so little to say that I hesitated to worry you until I had time to get into town and check on it. Peg and John have this to say. They returned late one night to find Morris in hiding in their house, a deserter. It was a terrific spot for them, for Jay is in the naval base and sworn to report all defalcations of any sort. But they harbored him anyway for 2 days. They fed him, talked with him, tried to find out what was on his mind, and finally gave him money for a lift down the road in the direction of a guy for whom he was bound, someone to advise him. It is heartbreaking. He spent one night on the floor in the little shack. He couldn't break into the big house. And on the shelf, wrapped in paper marked, quote, saved for M. Graves, was a piece of driftwood. Both C and I cried when we saw it. Really, it's simply pathetic. And yet he seems to have handled the whole business in just the worst possible way. I may need some propping from you or the Museum of Modern Art if I am to establish with the Army bunkos that he is really a painter and not a pathological case." This next letter is from Alfred Barr, the director of the Museum of Modern Art, who wrote to the Judge Advocate General of the Army, Myron Kramer, in July 1942. It begins, "We understand that Mr. Graves is now facing court-martial, apparently because his draft board failed to arrange for him the hearing for which he is entitled as a conscientious objector, and in spite of his repeated requests. In my opinion, Morris Graves is not only an artist of very exceptional talent, our museum has bought 16 of his works, but also a mystic, a man of deep religious feeling and experience whose conduct is governed by moral compulsions of a strength unknown to ordinary men. From a worldly point of view, he would be considered an eccentric, but so, I suppose, would most men of ordinary, extraordinary character. In any case, I believe completely in the sincerity and depth of his convictions. I believe that under the circumstances, Mr. Graves' claim as a conscientious objector should receive every consideration, not only for his sake, but in the interest of the just application of the selective service. Marion Willard appears in many chapters of this book, reflecting her multiple roles as a personal confidant, emotional sustainer, and his art dealer. In this letter from Morris Graves, he writes to Marion Willard from Camp Roberts, 1942. "Forgive me this one more groan, Marion, but oh God and everywhere, I've had enough of this army camp, this encampment of blindness and evil, and these men, regimented lost men, trapped in their flesh, but then I am trapped in my emotions in whimpering self-concern, and am only half-heartedly trying to fulfill the requirements of love. Trapped in the flesh too, I guess. Yes, that's it. I'm trapped both in the spirit and in the flesh, but better to be trapped than dead. Until I can better manage to swallow this shakedown in my life, I had better not write any more letters. But I want to cry to someone. The cost of the thing, in your life, in my life, but it has a healing in it, and if we can endure it, God have mercy on Europe and Asia." Graves was desperate to visit Japan as soon as the war ended. in order to aid in reconciliation and healing, as well as to benefit from the culture he deeply admired. In this letter, he refers to one of many letters he wrote seeking permission to enter the country. Morris Graves to his mother Helen, Honolulu, 1947. Mother dear, yesterday I met Ambassador Dean Acheson from Tokyo, and he advised that I not anticipate getting military permission to enter Japan for about another year. There is no housing for non-essential civilians. I feel stymied and ill. My desire to help in an immediate crisis and work among our Adamfeld neighbors and to come under the internationalizing and spiritualizing spell of the profound culture. In short, to be succared in this hateful, power-mad, military-blind, triumphed by bludgeon world is all shot to hell. It would be only deceitful to say that I'm not sick and angered to be waved aside as an artist non-essential in this military-contaminated age.
These readings affirm the chapter called Intimacy. Graves explicitly stated that his letters should not be censored. In a 1963 letter to his brother Wallace, he jokingly abandoned any reservations that he once had about disclosing his intimate relationships, a position that he explicitly reiterated later on. This is that letter from Morris to his brother Wallace, 1963. Too much known about one's sexual interests and behavior can be exhibitionist. Too little known about it is downright discouragingly dishonest. I'd far rather let it be openly known that some of my friends and acquaintances prefer their profound human exchange to be with girls rather than boys, than to conceal it. But I think it a bit unallowable to let it be known just yet that Toby was interested in ewes, or sheep in general. What a revealing frustration when one contemplates his nervous line paintings. This about Toby is a lie, but he was always mysteriously interested in stray dogs. Three younger men, pictured here, shared Graves' homes and were his domestic caretakers. There is considerable documentation of his relationship with the first two. Yonemitsu Orashiro lived with Graves from about 1947 to 1952, and Richard Sfari from about 1953 to 1963. Robert Yarber, who many of you heard earlier, now president of the Morris Graves Foundation, was rarely separated from Graves between 1973 and the artist's death in 2001. As a result, there is limited correspondence between them. This is Richard Sfari. Graves and Richard Sfari, who was 20 years younger, met in the early 1950s. In 1953, Sfari moved to Caerladen, the house Graves was building in Edmonds, Washington, assuming the roles of lover and caretaker that Yoni Arashiro had filled earlier. He soon moved to Ireland with Graves, his great love, with frequent separations that were usually precipitated by Graves' need for creative solitude and emotional independence. As the letters testify, Sfari was closely integrated into Graves' circle of friends, who usually supported and encouraged him. In 1958, during one of the frequent separations, Graves writes to Sfari from Ireland. Instead of it being a rest, it's just agony. I think of you trying for a life that will be more fulfilling. I think of you in the great complex of London, having to talk and pretend and ask and decide and try again and ask and pretend and decide alone. Then my whole heart is crushed and my chest convulsed and the crying has tears. How I hope the days will open for you and you will be absorbed in all that's new and fulfilling. I read this over and I see that it's a love letter to you. Graves had a close group of artist friends who called themselves the Otters. Richard Gilkey and Jan Thompson in the photograph are two of them. In this letter, Gilkey makes a nasty crack to Jan about Safari. Letter from Richard Gilkey to Jan Thompson, 1958. Morris is fine, nothing wrong. He has been resting and that has made all the difference. I think Richard is a stupid little whore and making Morris dance to his tune. But that is up to Morris. Nothing any of us could do would change his feelings about Richard. It makes me sick, but what can one do? In this letter from 1959, Safari writes to Graves' art dealer, Marion Willard, about his relationship with Graves. The letter mentions Woodtown Manor, the grand house that Graves bought and restored near Dublin, Ireland. Letter from Richard Safari to Marion Willard, Ireland, 1959. I added grief upon grief by a misjudged happenstance, together with the turmoil of Thanksgiving festivities, i.e. people in the house, which resulted in quiet and deadly truth sessions between Em and myself, in which I learned certain things, namely that my presence is seriously harmful to Em's processes. Servants eat their masters. That the folly of Woodtown, if folly is the right word, is half my doing. And that Em has a strong and violent desire to withdraw and recede without having the wasted energy and concern of me and my needs. I am convinced that I hinder Em's growth as the great painter he is, and that it is up to me to do something about ordering these precious processes. And to be perfectly honest with you, there is too much unhappiness and pain welling up in that noble heart to add any more. I'm 29 and need the opening world. This is a letter from Morris Graves to Richard Safari, 1960. I am solitary by nature, and this will not change. I am guilty of trying to convincingly appear as though I could include people in my life and adapt and adjust to it. I have in this way deceived friends and family and loving people like yourself, and also deceived myself. I am determined to live alone and accept the pain of it as at least not worse than living with people, and also not adding daily, weekly, and yearly pain to another's life. I must express my love as an artist and not as a friend to people or as an adaptable companion. Richard Safari writes to Morris Graves' art dealer Marion Willard from Ireland in 1960. Where is the light-hearted madcap whimsy that one loves so in Em? The jaw sets more, the eyes glint, and one becomes suspicious, or rather, as I say, wary. This letter is from Morris Graves to his otter friend, Jan Thompson, Ireland, 1960. For years, we had been like a hawk and a budgie, I hoping he would learn to fly and hunt, and he hoping I'd learn to perch and preen. His whole being must thrill to the fact that the lessons are over. In our clouded and willful ways, we wouldn't recognize that we were two totally different realms. How hard he tried. I love him for it. The film director John Huston and his wife Ricky lived near Woodtown Manor in Ireland. Ricky in particular became a close friend. In this letter, she writes to Richard Sfari from Ireland the same year, 1960. Richard, your way of feeling worth was to be a genius's slave. Recognize this. Letter from Morris Graves to Richard Sfari, same year. This energy that I speak of as potential anger also produces even more intense times of love. And it is these floods of love that I live by. Everything can be subject and object of this love. In those times, unpredictable times, I have loved grass and trees and wind and rain and creatures and people. And a few times I have been able to express it in paintings, and almost never in words or affection. It wells up with a feeling of heartbreak and is somehow like heartbreak and nearly destroys me, but it recreates me too. If this were not so, I wouldn't be alive today. If it were not so, I probably never would have painted. The noted sculptor, Richard Lippold, was, like Graves, represented by the Willard Gallery. Lippold writes this warning to Morris Graves from New York in 1962. Beauty and devotion seldom come in the same package. Don't be foolish, old man. And forgive me, too, for saying it. A letter from Morris Graves to Richard Sfari in about 1964. I cannot have dear, loving friends and solitude. I can have solitude and the deep reward from the act of painting and terrible, terrible loneliness. Morris Graves to Richard Sfari in 1965, about a year later. With sudden, amazing vividness, I thought back over the years, and all I seem to be able to remember is how many times we have made each other cry. Morris Graves to Richard Sfari from the Lake, Lolita, California, 1994, about 30 years later. I lie in my bed full of sorrow, memory, and today, sorrow, Woodtown.
Letters about art are included throughout this book, but especially in the sections about money and meaning. Chief among Graves' belief was the idea that the material world is an illusion. Painting and expression in matter must therefore lead the way to a higher consciousness and is not an end in itself. The split between the real and illusory was a duality in conflict with Graves' other dominant belief that the sacred resides in all things, and that man and universe are one. This was perhaps a more congenial philosophy for someone whose attachment to the physical world would not be overcome, and who used vessels, birds, and flowers as equivalents of himself. Nancy Wilson Ross introduced Graves to the New York art dealer Marion Willard in 1939. In the early 1940s, during the period surrounding his internment in the Army, Graves painted some of the most significant works of his long career and is widely shown at the Museum of Modern Art, where Alfred Barr was the director. From Morris Graves to Marion Willard, LaConner, Washington, 1940. Dear Marion, it was good to hear from you, and you are unanswered these weeks, chiefly because I'm earning my bread by hard labor, 12 and 14-hour days at a local pea cannery. I've done nothing with a purification series. I'm confused. I can't counterfeit the idea. It's not just decoration. But during recent weeks, I've done 30 or 40 temperas, like snakes, but chiefly of birds. Birds under the spell of the moon. Some hold up, many don't. Some are simply cute. I could have Mark Toby help me decide on a few and send them on to you, with others which I hope to start the moment the cannery either explodes or shuts down. This will be soon. If you want to show them, that would be fine. If you want to show them to Mr. Alfred Barr, that's agreeable with me. In fact, it's rather wonderful for me. This next letter is from Morris to his mother Helen and his brother Wallace, Anacortes, Washington, 1943. Yesterday I drew for 6 or 7 hours, trying to get the lines and light in dark planes that would make up the face of an ancient knowing bird, and then painted one in mist, but not entirely. But how? How do we remark with a painted bird upon the great inner reassurance that we have, that the steadiness of the outer cosmos is but a reflection of the godness of the whole creation, the available steadiness that men need and seek so they will not stumble and cry, lost. How on a piece of two-dimensional paper can you apply the volume of night skies and the plane of the earth? For this there are ways, even line tricks. But how to paint the mystery of a living thing brooding through and above the bird? This is not done by the paint or the brush or the mind. William Valentiner, director of the Detroit Institute of Art, visited Graves' first important home, the Rock near Anacortes. Valentiner writes to Marion Willard, Washington, 1943. He begins, "The place where he lives is indescribably beautiful. The house he built is perched on a rock like an eagle's nest. It makes one dizzy to look down into the valley 1,000 feet below. The valley is covered with green trees, which seem from above appear like a green ocean. At each end of the valley is a lake, one with an island in the center, and above the lakes rise another mountain. On one side, in the far distance, the Olympic Mountains, and on the other, Mount Baker. I stayed 2 nights, and I was treated like a prince. He cooks very well, and at meals placed the tray before me, either outside in the sun or in the evening before a fire, with all kinds of good things for which he himself ate very little. He told me I would not expect to see any paintings, and he had not done very much in the last year or more. But there are a few new ones hanging on the wall, among them a marvelous composition with an eagle as monumental as an Assyrian relief. All torn up, by the way, as he takes very little care of his works. The second day, he worked almost all day long, crouching on the floor near his bed, painting on gold and silver paper. He did not want to show me what he had done. They were just notes, he said. This next letter is from Morris Graves to Marion Willard, October 1943. Far and away the best painting I sent last week to the Northwest Annual Exhibition at the Seattle Art Museum. The raven has great beauty, the most energy, and swiftly whipped lines that even wrote themselves over a piece of paper for me. The raven is moon mad, but more, he is most wonderfully bewitched by the night darkness around him. Also, he is so hidden in a rock, I would like to sink into the paper with him. Elizabeth Bailey Willis, known to all as Betty Willis, was a friend of Graves since the 1930s and was hired by Marion Willard to show his paintings at the gallery. She is the mother of photographer Mary Bramlett. Morris Graves to Marion Willard and Betty Willis, January 1945. Poetically, I learned that the profound can be heightened unbearably by translating it, or commenting upon it, or diverting our focus upon it, by frivolity. Do you see what I mean? Heretofore I sought learning by brooding upon the great, the cosmic, like the weather, for instance. The inkling that I speak of is this. One must make candy over the fireplace while there is a great night electric storm. Frivolous diversion is kin to the side vision of the physical eye. As for the paintings, I think they are successful only in achieving the most depressing color possible. It is the brown-gray color that runs through them all. On some of them, I like bits of the painting. I like the almost uncontrollable ground of the ink. It invites the eye and mind into a quality of activity which is very close to the feeling and looking upon the elder world of nature. I like the poetic beginnings of the other paintings. I like the feel of vaguely defined spaces in the one where the bird is first mad enough to see a light, and in the one where the bird is stomping around in circles, and the one where the bird is first daft enough to stand on her tiptoes. My mind is not lost or wandering or pausing with these painted comments of world conditions. It's just the clearing out of some sucker shoots to concentrate on its real growth energy. He continues, I included 3 winter leaves, and there are 4 or 5 more, which come as close or miss as far as those sent. Simply, I saw a long wind slam down some winter leaves and molest others, lodged in their disintegrating rest. In all worlds, small things are explained by the great, and the great by the small. But for Morris only do the winter leaves break open the heart. I cannot regret how else they fail. Dorothy Miller, curator of painting and sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art, included Graves in our exhibition, Americans 1942, 18 artists from 9 states. This exhibition established Graves as a significant contemporary artist in America. Morris Graves writes Dorothy Miller, Inishbeg, Ireland, 1955. He begins, painting is an experience which is often resisted and is still predominantly a mixture of anxiety and despair. I could say I paint to save my life. To the feelings of anxiety and despair is always added a kind of awful delight, a kind of bliss, also a not caring, or a caring simultaneously in an obsessive way. Also a sadness and a sense of futility. Futility because the experience does not endure. It is not final, but always ebbs and it must always ebb and be re-experienced. I paint to kill time, to annihilate time, to integrate, to get beyond the relative, to gain knowledge of origin, to sense, to search out destination. And that's our final letter for this afternoon. Thank you very much.
We'd be happy to answer questions if you have any questions from the audience, so you can come up. Yes?
Rather silly
What is he holding in his hand? Yes, it is a tuning fork, which was given to him by his friend Alfred Friedman Kane, and who was a physician. And the photo is by Dorothy Norman, who likened Graves, sort of himself, to a tuning fork, feeling the vibrations of the cosmos. And she took this photo using that tuning fork. Yeah?
One of the things I found a bit disturbing in the letters is that even at the age of 50, he starts talking about himself being old. That seems to be a theme that comes up more and more. And maybe it's a question for Robert, because he would know more if this was something that obsessed him so much as he did get older. But
I mean, about aging?
yeah,
That the beat
he talks in
aging
the letters
is.
about I'm 50 already, I'm 60, and it's like, oh.
I think it's part of the person always challenging himself.
Yeah.
I mean, spiritually, aesthetically, creatively, the fact that he would take on extraordinary physical labor to create the special places that he did. And so this is a man that grew through challenges. And when that ages you, I think you feel that anxiety, despair. But when you come out the other end, what great exhilaration. And so I think you see both of that in the letters.
Yeah, well, by 30 or 40, he's already had a life.
Well, I think for me there are two things. One is that he's often with younger men, much younger men. So there's a feeling of being older in comparison. And the other is a generational difference. I can remember reading British novels in which, women were just over the hill before they were 30. Their life was over. And I think that is also somewhat part of it.
Well, it's certainly a constant theme.
It is
Sorry letters between the two of them.
well, in Sfari, Sfari was quite young. Graves had done probably the greatest work of his life at that point. Not that he didn't come up to it, but he didn't surpass what he had done. So there was a lot of difference in experience and maturity.
Robert, do you have a perspective on that question about the era of aging? Because he had some really interesting thoughts about death.
Yeah, I think you hit it right there. Morris had a death wish from practically the age 3. His love of zero and nothing, and that life is just, in a way, all of this is not enough. It's a throwaway. And Jan got quite tired of Morris sometimes, always thinking about death. She said, "Oh, Dan, you men, you always think about death and dark things. Why don't you think about joy and life and immortality?" But it was that tension, and I think it was with Morris all throughout his life. But he was a great paradox, so what he said, he could say, "Oh yeah, I'm so tired of this," and then the next day he would be just enthusiastic about things. So there's no answer to it, Keith.
Yes, I had a question about that particular time in the 40s and 50s with the bohemian artists in New York and the explosion of poetry writing, the arts with Ferlinghetti and Paul Bowles and Burroughs and so on. Were there any relationships that he had at that time with those particular beat artists?
I mean, certainly Ferlinghetti and the San Francisco community of artists and poets, his circle was wide and broad and diverse and extraordinarily contemporary. And there are times when he's in company with Truman Capote. But even in the company of someone like Capote, their lives doesn't necessarily interact, or there's a purposeful exchange between these people. Through his community of friends like Nancy Wilson Ross, certainly introduced him to the great writers of Asian religions and East Asian culture, and his introduction, to psychedelics and things like that involved people like Alan Watts. But Graves he was substantial in himself, and so I think I think what he sought were the people and the places that he was most comfortable and familiar with.
Were there letters between the Beats and?
I don't associate him with the
No.
Beats at all, personally. He seemed much more attuned to the hippie culture of the 70s, to the Age of Aquarius, to the non-materialistic world of young hippies. I think he was perhaps not very realistic about it, but he had a romantic view of that youth culture. In terms of his artistic relationships, Willard Gallery dealt with important artists, Mark Tobey, Richard Lippold, Lionel Feininger, but was in some ways outside the norm of New York art world, which was obsessed at this time with abstract expressionism. So you do have these different communities, and there are not a great number of letters between Graves and any of, I know of no letters between Graves and the people you mentioned in particular.
Yeah, certainly not with the Beats. There are with Ferlinghetti, I believe, and when they were working on some poetic devices.
Did you have a question?
I was going to ask if you talk more about his choice of colors and his limited choice of colors.
It's not as limited as, when you begin to look at his, Color it's not as limited as what we find in museums, what they chose to acquire and exhibit. He worked very hard in creating what he called this boring ground, this sort of brooding brown ground, but they always had texture. I think a lot of it related to his materials, that he was using water-based mediums, that he took to the sumi-e, he took to the black inks. Other periods in time, he was really working hard with burnishing, with beeswax to give it lacquer finishes. And so this first call and desire to seek out the culture of Asia, especially Japan, and those artist materials, I think were an early influence.
But you can't say that the later flower paintings or any of the flower paintings have the same monochromatic feeling as the 1940s birds or ink on paper works do. So he didn't really talk a lot in the letters about color, except for what Larry read.
Your comments on his work after he moved back to the States back in 1965.
You mean from Ireland?
No.
Oh.
He moved back to the States. He purchased the property, the lake.
Oh, the lake.
And he didn't do a lot of art for a long time during the building of the lake. For me, he has two great bodies of work. One is from the 40s, that are the Asian influence Sumi, and then his later body of work, which are the flower paintings. For me, those are the two really great periods of work that both are transcendent, I think, in different ways. But there were long periods when he did no work at all, a lot because he was so involved in these incredibly complicated and costly building projects. And you find his dealer in particular getting extremely frustrated with him because as soon as he would just about finish a project, he would move and start another one. And there are various letters in the book in which his brother, his dealer, other people are saying, get a grip, do your art. Stop needing to move and to build, but focus.
And then when you experience these places that he created, they are works of art. Robert Desiree at the lake will attest what a beautiful creation the lake is. And it's a built environment, it's his design, it's his way he integrates daily life into our natural surroundings. the place in Edmonds called Woodtown. It's really an extraordinary structure in terms of design and architecture, modernism. The Valentiner letter, where he describes Anacortes and the Rock. What a special place. Can you imagine building a very modest house structure, but at that precipice, at that place, the Rock? And so these places that he put a lot of his creativity and aesthetic into.
But they were all money out.
Money out. Art in, right?
James, you had a question in the back?
Well, I wanted to talk about Morris Graves as the archivist. Did he have any sense that these letters were going to become public? The sense of saving these for people to read?
I think he must have. The question was, did he have a sense that these letters would be published? He very clearly addresses his brother in a letter. We don't quote about publication and freedom to publish any of them. In the 1950s, early 1950s, he writes to his dealer, Marion Willard, and he says, I have all these letters. If you think they're important for me to save for any reason, let me know. If not, I'll burn them. And he doesn't hear back from her, and he burns them. And then he regrets it so deeply that he saves everything, but everything. And so we have from his letters from the 50s on, and then we have, for the earlier letters, other people saving his letters. So the Willard Gallery, probably one of the most important troves of letters, were from that relationship starting in the early 40s that went until the 80s. And if Marion Willard had not saved those early letters, well, his mother saved the letters. So, late in life, his mother says, oh, I thought I would get rid of these, but I couldn't, and she gives them all back to him. So we have these letters starting in the 20s from his mother, and then the 40s from the Willard Gallery, and then the 50s from the Morris Graves Foundation in particular. And so there are these different periods in which we have the letters. But I just think that nobody saves that much unless they think something important will come of it.
We also owe a debt to his brother Wallace Graves, who had intended throughout his life to write the biography and who helped Morris in establishing what would become the papers here that we have in special collections. And if it wasn't for Wallace, it would have been a lot more difficult for Vicki and I to begin to have delved through the sort of complexity of material.
One more question. Go ahead.
Did he write at all about photography? He obviously loved to be a subject of great photography.
Oh, no, he writes about hating it, hating to be a subject. This is one of those cases in which you kind of doubt him. Because he was this gorgeous subject of photography. I mean, there's just isn't an ugly picture of him, and he's clearly posed not only by the photographer, but he has input into it.
But he never talked about in terms of art and the art of photography.
No. Very late in his career, didn't he use an XX70 and he would photograph little still lifes and things like that? But I don't know if that was just because he was playing with technology or this was something that he was trying to capture aesthetically. Do you know, Robert?
Well, I know we had a little instant
Right.
Polaroid camera that
Right.
he used to take pictures of. But he did say the two downers of the 20th century were electricity and photography.
Thank you all.